So the tide of Chaos Dwarves will soon arrive. Wait, where is Thorgrim?
The last I saw of him, he was smashing chairs, tables, and even his own book in rage, shouting quite loudly that there is no such thing as a Chaos Dwarf, and that we were all being played like fools by the Changer of Ways. I think he's actually crying over his own poor race.
Is he angry now that the best dwarves are his Chaos kin? By Sigmar, I think I must prepare the defenses of the Empire to protect against the angry ones. The last time the dwarves were so furious they burnt half the world to cinder.
Surely it can't be that bad.
Silence, scum! There will be much blood to be spilled over this abomination. $25 for a glorified reskin pack? Why, the Changer of Ways must be laughing all the way to the bank with what he has done. Mark my words, only a complete doddering imbecile would bother paying such a sum. Certainly no true dwarf would ever fall to chaos. This must be a race of costumed orcs. It can be the only explanation. I refuse to accept any other excuse for what we are seeing.
Cheer up, Thorgrim. Look at it this way. At least Grimgor will be annihilated by a tide of costumed greenskins, or at worst he will wipe them out with extreme prejudice. Isn't that ideal for you?
Luther, what have you done? You maniac, you have doomed us all with your words.
Enough! I will not sit here and listen to this nonsense. You will pay for your insults, vampire. The entire world will pay. The true Dawi will march for our reckoning, and any and all past insults will be paid in blood.
I think you should sit back, relax, and stop being so salty they are not as short as you.
Welcome everyone, Costin here with the discussion about the Chaos Dwarf DLC for Total War Warhammer 3, Immortal Empires, and Realms of Chaos. The Chaos Dwarf DLC will be released on the 13th of April in just less than 4 weeks. And one of the big topics of discussion that has quickly emerged is, of course, the price, because this piece of DLC content is the most expensive DLC content we've ever had for a Total War game, barring the expansion packs like Fall of the Samurai or Rise of the Samurai. If we look at Steam, the current price is €22.50. But the baseline price, the actual price, is €25. The promotion here will end on the 20th of April, so if you want to wait, you can wait. You can see what's when it comes out, how it is, how these guys play via many gameplay videos, reviews, etc., and then make the decision whether or not you're going to buy it. But let's be clear on this. This is the most expensive piece of DLC content, by far and away. I've looked at prices back in the day. I've done searches. And when we're looking at DLC for Warhammer 2, Warhammer 1, Free Kingdoms, other games, this is by far and away the most expensive. Before that, it was hovering around the €20 range, really 19 if we're looking at like Vampire Coast, Call of the Beastmen, all of that. And by the way, Call of the Beastmen DLC was actually very expensive for a very, very long time. Of course, Lord packs are generally cheaper than race packs. Race packs are the more expensive ones. Now, people will obviously talk about ogres, but the ogres are not your regular race pack. Because what the ogres are, what Norska is, and what the Warriors of Chaos are as well, they're race packs for races that were designed during the production of the base game, then stripped away from the base game, put in a DLC so they can nickel and dime you. People can give whatever excuses they want on that. That's what's happening. Now, Creative Assembly did say with the Warriors of Chaos that they wouldn't have made them as in-depth as they did if they weren't releasing it as part of the DLC, but that's a pretty screwed up development cycle, to be quite honest. That you're unwilling to make a proper race unless you can sell it as a DLC, a 5th race like that. Now, Warriors of Chaos was plagued with numerous issues. Now, that's, by the way, one of the problems when you have these kind of nickel and diming DLCs, that there's a lot of issues that get created. Is it any wonder that all of the race packs, all the races that were added via DLC, Day 1 DLC, had significant issues? Well, with the exception of the Rome 2 one, and even when we started with these pre-order DLC packs, like Shogun 2 Fall of Samurai is where it started. It wasn't Warhammer 1. It wasn't even Rome 2. For all the issues that we still have in the Total War series because of Rome 2, in terms of gameplay design, in terms of DLC packs, it wasn't Rome 2 or Warhammer 1, it was Shogun 2 Fall of Samurai that added the pre-order faction. Not a race, a faction. with regards to the pre-order bonus there. The Blood Pack came also in Shogun 2 as well. And people have accepted that over the years. They've accepted these kind of shitty DLC practices. Though I think a lot of people are up in arms because we've had better DLC practices from Creative Assembly since then in quite a few ways. We look at all the many DLC packs that we got for Warhammer 2 in particular, and I think in a lot of ways they did Warhammer 2 right, because they didn't have a pre-order DLC race. They had the race that they added in Warhammer 1, and only much later did they add it in Warhammer 2, Norska specifically. Then of course there are all the Lord packs and even the race packs that we got there. Quite a lot of value gained from that. Now, to be fair, I obviously don't think very highly of the Vampire Coast. I think there were a lot of issues in terms of the design of that race, and kind of felt like they were just stealing ideas from other races and adding it as part of the DLC pack. Tomb Kings is considered the gold standard, though I wasn't too fond of the Tomb Kings. Still am not too fond of the Tomb Kings, though it certainly was a unique race that they added for Legendary Lords. Lots of value to be gained with that. Some interesting campaigns as well. What are my feelings on this subject? Well, I think when it comes to these kind of things, that it depends on what people are willing to accept and what people are willing to defend. One of the frustrating things that I saw in the Total War community before the release of Warhammer 1, to be very clear, things have changed since then, and I would say that the community has certainly improved in a lot of ways since then. But there were a lot of fanboys. There were a lot of people who were defending these DLC practices. A lot of people were defending Rome 2 for all the horrible things they did in that game. A lot of people that I remember when they announced that they were working on Warhammer 1, that a lot of people are, oh, they're not going to have magic, flying units, monstrous units. Like, that's what people were saying, to be clear, on places like Total War Center and the official Total War forums. Like, oh, you can't expect monstrous units and all that kind of stuff. Because what the community back then, the horrible community back then, the fanboys are like, oh yeah, just like reskin races, don't make anything unique. Thankfully, Creative Assembly did go in a very different direction, and they did go in a much better direction, by the way. They improved the engine, they improved the performance, they did a lot of things, contrary to what the fanboys were saying they wouldn't do or they couldn't do. The poor performance issues that we used to have in Total War games. I mean, performance isn't great even now in Total War, but I gotta say, compared to what we had before the release of Warhammer 1, is significantly better. So things have improved, and it feels like we're just taking a step back, a major step back with this. If people accept this, it's just going to become the norm. Just like pre-order DLC became the norm when people accepted the release of Warriors of Chaos. Now, I have to say that the reason people accepted the state of affairs with Warhammer 1, with the race pack there, is because of all the things that Creative Assembly did right with Warhammer 1. The performance improvements, the uniqueness of each race, the mechanics of the campaigns. I mean, Warhammer 1 hasn't aged well right now, but they put a lot of effort with that. When a lot of us in the Total War community, those of us that have been playing the series for years and years and years, didn't necessarily expect them to. It's been a rough road over the last 2 decades. That's how long I've been playing Total War, almost 2 decades, since Rome 1, basically. It's been a rough road, especially in that period between Empire and Warhammer 1. There were a lot of horrible DLC decisions, horrible games, horrible decisions, horrible business practices. And I guess one of the things that pisses me off with what Creative Assembly has been doing in some parts since then is they've kind of taken a step back, right? Three Kingdoms was a disaster. Troy was a disaster. Now, I don't hate Three Kingdoms or Troy, but there were certainly very questionable decisions with those games, and it's no surprise that both those games are currently dead, despite a lot of promise shown to them. But yeah, it feels like they're taking a step back with this, increasing the price. But why are they doing so? Beyond the fact that people will accept it, and it seems like they will. A lot of people have been excited about the Cast Dwarfs for a very long time, including myself. And to be very clear, as a content creator on YouTube who's currently focused on Total War, I have every reason in the world to want this DLC to be successful. I have every reason in the world to want them to sell as many copies as possible. That's where I stand I have no reason whatsoever for this to fail, because if it fails, it means less viewers, less interest on my channel. If this fails, then overall interest in Total War is going to drop. By the way, that's a danger point. That's a danger that I'm currently seeing at the moment in Total War, is what's going to happen after Warhammer 3. And hell, what's going to happen when Warhammer 3, because Realms of Chaos has been a disaster, suffice it to say. And I do find it questionable that they've decided to release the Chaos Dwarfs in Realms of Chaos. It makes sense, but I'm pretty sure out of the player base that's currently playing Total War Warhammer 3, 80-90% are playing Immortal Empires, and only Immortal Empires. I've played a bit of Realms of Chaos since Immortal Empires. It's a joke of a campaign. It's so poorly designed compared to Immortal Empires. It was funny when people were saying, like, oh, Realms of Chaos can be more difficult. I was like, have you played Realms of Chaos compared to Immortal Empires on Legendary difficulty? It is not difficult at all. I can tell you that's one of the cases. It's so damn easy. Unless the faction is completely broken, then you might have some issues, but even then, no night and day difference when it comes to the two of them. Night and day difference. But I think they made the decision to make the story content, because that's likely what we're going to get in Realms of Chaos with the Chaos Dwarves. They decided to make the story content for the Chaos Dwarves in Realms of Chaos before they made the decision, which is a more recent one, to release Immortal Empires to everyone that just owns game free. Because if they hadn't made that decision, yeah, it makes sense. I wonder what's going to happen in the future with that. I personally think that wasting resources on Realms of Chaos at the moment is just a waste of time, especially since the Dwarves, like, it says a lot about Realms of Chaos that they decide they're not going to focus on Ursun's campaign with it, with the Chaos Dwarves, just like they did with Champions of Chaos. Now, why is Creative Assembly doing this? Why is Sega actually doing this? Because they own Creative Assembly. Remember this. Sega have a lot of power. Now, I'm not the kind of person who says that developers are innocent victims and it's always the big bad publishers. I actually hate that kind of thinking, because for years I saw a lot of people blame, say, for instance, Electronic Arts for decisions that they didn't make. When it came to, say, the quality of BioWare games or other things, no, BioWare sunk themselves. BioWare made a bunch of bad decisions, and not every decision that a company makes, or not every bad decision that you see in a video game is made by the publisher. But when it comes to pricing, it certainly is the publisher that's having an impact on that, or the major impact on this. So why is Sega increasing the prices of DLC? Is it inflation, as many people would say? To some extent, I can imagine it is, but I don't believe it is fully. To go from just shy of $20, 20 euros, 19 euros specifically, to 25, there's a lot more than just inflation. Because in order to increase prices by a quarter, you got to ask yourself, have their own costs of doing business increased by a quarter? Beyond the electricity prices, which, yes, they have risen. We're living in the aftermath of a pandemic, which is still ongoing. The pandemic hasn't over. It's just diminished, and lockdowns have ended. But we're still dealing with the economic impact of the pandemic. We're also dealing with a major economic impact of the war in Ukraine, which has significant impact on agricultural prices and energy prices because of the importance of Russia and Ukraine in those sectors. Agriculturally for both of them, fertilizer in Russia, is particularly grain for Ukraine specifically, energy when we're talking about Russia. And prices have risen dramatically for a lot of people around the world. That said, while certainly hardware prices, electricity prices have risen, the only way the cost of doing business for Sega would have risen by a quarter is if they were paying their people by almost as much. Because that's the main cost, really, for any company, the people they hire, the people that work for them. And I find it very unlikely that they've increased salaries by a quarter for all their employees over the last year. No, that's not the reason. It's part of the reason, I imagine, that's driving up costs, but it's not the reason. Now, some people will argue, well, game prices haven't risen for a while, and it makes sense during inflation. That's an excuse. That's all I'm going to say. That is an excuse. The costs have not risen by a quarter in just a year. That is a lie. Now, Certainly, companies did pay a significant price during the pandemic to get people to work from home, the hardware required for that, all the complications that arose from that. Absolutely. But gaming companies also recorded, and companies in general, in the digital sphere, we're looking at game developers, we're looking at software developers, we're looking at hardware developers, NVIDIA, AMD. They recorded record profits during the pandemic because people stayed at home. They were watching more movies on streaming services. They were buying more computer hardware. They were buying laptops, gaming consoles. They were buying more games. And we saw record profits for at least a year during the pandemic. Just look at Activision. I follow Activision pretty closely because of my interest in Blizzard games. They saw record profits during one fiscal year. But those have gone down. And that's really what I think is driving this increase in prices that we're seeing in gaming in general, not just for this DLC. And mind you, it's not just Sega doing this, it's gaming companies pretty much across the board that are raising prices, some more than others. I'd say Activision in particular is being very greedy at the moment, but they can afford to do so because they have something people want and people are willing to pay those absurd prices. But prices are going up because these companies recorded record profits. Then those profits disappeared because the pandemic diminished. Not over, diminished. Lockdowns are no longer happening. People are going outside, not buying games as much as they were, not playing games as much as they were. This is, by the way, affecting YouTubers, content creators on Twitch and YouTube just as much because we have fewer people watching us. It's not the only reason, at least in the Total War sphere, why numbers have diminished. Like Legend of Total War was talking, and one of his viewers was saying, well, it's because people are going out now that the pandemic has diminished. It's not the only reason. The quality of the game, the situation of the game is also a major reason when it comes to that. But it is corporate greed. And you either accept it and prices will stay like this going forward. Either people accept this as the new norm or they don't. And this DLC fails. Now, for what it's worth, I personally hope it doesn't fail. But I'm also not particularly enthusiastic about this increase in prices. Because I've been in that position where I've struggled financially for many, many years. I don't anymore. But I've been in that situation. People gotta understand. $25 is not the same thing for everyone. Not even in a Western country, let alone outside of Western countries. You gotta also understand, people play these games around the world. And the increase of prices for games, the increase of computer hardware is hitting people very hard in certain parts of the world. Yes, for some people, $25, $22 may not matter at all. As one person left a comment on the poll I've done on this subject, he said, it's cheaper to pay $22 than to go to a restaurant. He's right, it is. But not everyone goes to a restaurant. Certainly not on a regular basis when it comes down to it. I personally don't do that on a regular basis. Just don't like doing it because the prices are pretty insane when it comes to restaurants at the moment. But that is a reality. For some people, this money doesn't matter at all. For some, it does matter a great deal. So if you have hundreds or thousands of dollars in disposable income, then it doesn't matter, right? But not everyone has thousands of dollars. Actually, very few people have thousands of dollars in disposable income. If you're paying a lot of things on a daily basis, then yeah, 25 euros for a DLC pack that you're probably going to invest dozens of hours into, or you may invest dozens of hours into, is not really significant. That is true. But I also think people shouldn't ignore this aspect. And I know a lot of reviewers and content creators do, or they don't understand it. Obviously, those of us that do this as a living, we cover these games or we cover products as a living, we're never going to see things in a similar vein as people who just play it for fun. Because for us, it's just, even if we have to pay for it, and we don't necessarily have to pay for it, there's a lot of review copies that go around, but even if we have to pay for it as the cost of business, we'll just pay for it as the cost of business because we need to cover those games to have content to earn our living. That's just the reality for us. So we're never going to see things in the same way. But I also do think that prices going up by this much so quickly, it is just corporate greed. It's companies being very happy about the profits they recorded before and trying to maintain those kind of profits as much as possible now that the pandemic is quote-unquote over. That's what's at stake here. Now, do I think the price will be worth it beyond those kind of issues? Well, I think the fundamental question is going to be the following. How good is this DLC going to be? And when I say good, I'm not talking about just like, oh, how many legendary lords they're going to have, how many legendary heroes they're going to have, what mechanics they're going to have in a campaign. That's all well and good, but if it's a similar situation like the Warriors of Chaos have gone through recently with the Champions of Chaos DLC, I'll probably say it's not going to be worth it. Because Champions of Chaos, amazing rework, great job on the mechanics, superb gameplay mechanics. Some of the best legendary lords in the game, lots of power, great mechanics, lots of fun potentially. Unfortunately, not really. The reason that's not the case is they made the DLC that had a lot of power behind it, so much so that the other factions are just far beneath them. And that's the issue that has torn down the Warriors of Chaos, because just playing a campaign where you just bot resolve virtually every battle of your campaign or only fight a handful of them is not necessarily a fun campaign. Especially when you don't have anything at risk. You can't lose territory, you're not at risk of losing territory, your vassals can buy you time or diminish enemy forces. A lot of issues when it comes to that. So if that's what we're going to get to the Chaos Dwarves, another campaign or 3 campaigns where we just get legendary lords and a new race that has a significant amount of power that they can just steamroll all their opponents, that's not going to be fun. Now, that's not me advocating for them to make annoying mechanics that slow you down. That can be just as disastrous. But I think the problem is that right now, some races are so far ahead of others, it's not even funny. It is a major issue currently in the game. It's especially an issue in the area of the Realms of Chaos, because Kislev has a lot of issues. The Dwarves have a lot of issues. The Empire has a lot of issues, especially in that crucial early game period. So if they don't fix those issues, if they don't improve that situation for those kind of factions, and I know people will say, oh, the Empire is fine. It is not fine. Let me ask you the following question. When has anyone played a campaign recently on the highest difficulties where they were playing a faction like the Warriors of Chaos, Greenskins, or Vampire Counts, where they actually struggled against the Empire or the Dwarves? Probably not very likely. That you can make it work when you're playing it, sure. But that's not all that matters. Like the High Elves, they're a great race, not just because they're good when you play them, but also they do provide a fairly decent challenge when you're going up against them, even with a gigantic amount of power. Like I've invaded Ulfwan in a recent campaign as Grom the Punch, and I can tell you, dealing with Tyrion and Alariel, that ain't a cakewalk. Sure, I'm winning, because I know what I'm doing, but isn't just like me going from battle to battle, auto-resolving everything in my path and just annihilating the enemy with ease. No, I'm having to put in effort. And if they don't resolve that issue, if they don't improve certain factions that desperately need them, especially in the early game, which is the most crucial portion of any campaign, then the Chaos Dwarves are just going to end up being a Champions of Chaos or Warriors of Chaos situation, which is a great race, great design, great mechanics, but boring as dirt to play. And that's my hope that's what I hope they avoid, and that's what I'm concerned about when it comes to them. And to be clear, if this DLC fails, then Warhammer 3 itself is in some serious trouble. I don't think it's going to fail anytime soon. I don't think we're going to see a Free Kingdom situation. But if this DLC fails, then we've got some serious problems on our hands going forward in the future of Warhammer 3. Now, to be clear, I think Warhammer 3 is always going to be played by people in Immortal Empires just because there's still plenty of well-designed races that have good campaigns, and there's a lot of content in there, unlike Free Kingdoms with all the issues it had. But there's going to be some severe issues going forward for that. And you might see, by the way, you might see the player count drop off a cliff if they don't do a great job with this one. If they don't improve and fix many of the issues the game has. So I'd say the most significant aspect with this DLC, on whether or not it's worth it or not to buy it, the most significant question is, what are you going to do? What is Creative Assembly going to do in patch 3.0? What are they going to add? What are they going to fix? What solutions are they going to bring forward for the many problems that currently exist in Immortal Empires, especially in certain parts of the campaign map, especially with certain races, especially with the design of certain races and how they play out right now on any difficulty of the game. That's what I think about it. Costin is signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.